The revolver lay on the mahogany desk under a single spotlight, its black steel catching light like a promise. Elias Vance stood over it, breathing hard, his hand trembling as he reached for the gun. "He's getting out on parole tomorrow, Lena," he had whispered. "Because of you. We have 6 hours to stop him." But the warehouse burned now with both of them inside. Elias screaming, Marcus descending into fire and smoke, and Lena running through the flames with love letters clutched against her chest. 13 hours earlier, the studio had been silent. The soundproofed walls of the recording studio absorbed everything, the rain hammering against the skylight, the hiss of the ventilation system, the electric hum of waiting equipment. Elias sat behind the mahogany desk, adjusting the height of the Silver Shure SM7B microphone with methodical precision. His fingers, stained yellow with nicotine, trembled as he tightened the metal clamp. He had been sitting in this position for 3 minutes, though it felt like longer. The fear was always worse before the interview began. He opened the manila folder labeled Case Nur 492, Julian Vane. The photograph slid out easily, a young man with a bright smile, a blue scarf wrapped loosely around his neck. The photo was creased at the corners. Someone had underlined the name Julian in thick red ink, pressing so hard the marker had torn through the paper. Elias stared at that underline for a long time. 7 years had passed since Julian's body was found in Blackwood Park. 7 years since Marcus Hendricks had been convicted and sent to Blackwood Penitentiary. 7 years of documentary work, of obsessive research, of sleepless nights spent piecing together a story that the world had already forgotten. But Elias hadn't forgotten. The heavy door of the studio thudded shut. Footsteps on carpet, the wet squelch of soaked shoes. Lena entered, and for a moment, the professional part of Elias, the producer, the interviewer, the man who had built a reputation on emotional restraint, nearly broke. She wore a damp beige trench coat. Water dripped from the hem onto the floor, pooling around her boots in small mirrors that reflected the studio lights. Lena's eyes went directly to the photograph in Elias's hand. "I didn't think you'd have his picture out," she said. Her voice was hollow, accusatory, a voice that had learned to weaponize disappointment. Elias flipped the photo face down onto the desk with his palm, as if the action could erase what had just been seen. He gestured to the black leather stool across from him, the one designed for confessions, for the vulnerable, for the broken. "Sit, please," he said, sliding a glass of water across the desk. The glass left a wet ring on the polished wood, and the condensation on it obscured the image of the photograph underneath. Lena sat. She gripped her knees, knuckles white. The leather of the stool creaked under her weight. When she looked up, her eyes caught on the red record light on the console, and the light reflected directly into her pupils, twin red points in the darkness of her gaze. "Tell me why you went back to the prison today," Elias said, his voice dropping lower, probing. For the 10th time. It was a flashback that came next, though not in the way Elias had intended. Lena's mind left the studio momentarily, her body remaining still on the leather stool, and she was back at Blackwood Penitentiary. Noon light, institutional fluorescence. The glass partition between her and the prisoner was thick enough to resist hammers. Lena sat on one side. Marcus Hendricks sat on the other, wearing the standard faded orange jumpsuit. His scars were visible across his knuckles, old, white lines that told stories of violence, of survival, of years spent behind razor wire and concrete. Marcus placed his hand against the glass. The static hiss of the intercom phone crackled between them. He leaned in closer, and his breath fogged the glass into a white veil. His eyes weren't cold. This was what made it worse. What had drawn Lena back to the prison 10 times, 11 times, until she'd lost count. His eyes were filled with a terrifying, soulful familiarity, tenderness and hunger existing in the same moment. "You're wearing Julian's scent," Marcus had whispered into the phone. "Lavender and tobacco." The words had sat heavy in her chest all afternoon. Even now, in the studio, she could smell it on herself. Back in the present, in the recording space, Lena reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the folded piece of paper, and she pulled it out with shaking hands. It was a drawing, charcoal on yellowed paper. A face, her own face, but rendered through Marcus's hand, rendered with an accuracy that suggested intimate study. The lines were precise, capturing the exact curve of her jaw, the particular slope of her cheekbone. It was beautiful, which made it unbearable. "I should hate the hands that killed my brother," Lena whispered, her voice barely reaching the microphone. "But when he touched the glass, I wanted to break through it and hold him." Elias stood abruptly. His chair slid backward and crashed against the soundproofed wall with a muted thud, the foam pyramids absorbing the violence of the gesture. He reached across the desk and seized the charcoal drawing from Lena's hands. As he did, he noticed something in the corner of the sketch that he hadn't seen before. A small symbol. A bird rendered in just a few strokes. A bird with a broken wing. Elias's hand went to his chest, beneath his shirt, where his own tattoo waited in the darkness against his skin. The exact same bird. The exact same broken wing. He leaned over the desk, his face inches from Lena's. His eyes had changed. The careful producer mask had cracked open to reveal something raw and dangerous underneath. He slammed his palm down on the charcoal sketch, and it tore slightly at the edge, the crackling of fragile paper against flesh filling the small studio. "He didn't just kill Julian," Elias said, his voice dropping to something flat and threatening. "He's been talking to you about me, hasn't he?" Lena's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She grabbed the drawing from under his hand and bolted for the door. The heavy brass handle rattled beneath her fingers as she fumbled with it, her panic making her clumsy. Behind her, she heard Elias move, the scrape of his chair, the pounding of his footsteps on carpet. He caught her in the hallway, tackling her into the sound-dampening foam of the wall. The gray pyramids cushioned their impact, but only slightly. Elias pinned her with his full weight, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, trapping her against the foam. His other hand found her wrist, twisting it upward, the charcoal sketch crumpling between them. Lena kicked backward with the heel of her leather boot, trying to connect with his shin. The impact was glancing, not enough to make him release her, but he grunted in pain. She clawed at his face, her fingernails raking across his cheek. 3 red lines opened up beneath her nails, and blood began to well in the scratches, warm and bright. Elias didn't flinch. He slammed his forearm up into her throat, not hard enough to choke, but hard enough to pin. His other hand wrenched the drawing from her grip. The paper tore at the edge, and the torn piece fluttered away like a dying butterfly. When he released her, she stumbled backward, gasping. The silver key was already in his hand. He locked the hallway door with a decisive click. "Sit down," he said, his voice jagged and icy. "We aren't finished with the interview." Back in the studio, the red record light had been running the entire time. Every word, every struggle, every gasp was captured on the hard drive. Elias moved to the mixing console, and he slid a fader upward. A digital screen displayed a rhythmic green wave, a sound file labeled Visit Log Excerpt. The casual title hid the violence contained within it. The audio played. Marcus's voice emerged from the speakers. but it was a different voice than the one that had whispered tenderness through the prison phone. This voice was colder, stripped of all artifice. In the background of the recording, metal clanged against metal. Other inmates. The prison yard. Marcus was speaking to someone else, not to Lena, not to Elias, to another man, his cellmate, his confidant in the way that survival breeds confidants. "She's easy," Marcus said through the speaker. "She thinks I'm his soulmate. 1 more month and she'll bring the bag." The audio crackled with a laugh, Marcus's laugh, cruel and mechanical. "She thinks she loves me. I just love her brother's inheritance." Lena covered her ears with both hands. She shook her head violently, as if she could dislodge the words from her mind, send them back into the speaker and out of her consciousness. She looked at the locket on her neck. Silver, delicate, the one she had received on her 15th birthday. The one she had touched 1,000 times in moments of sadness or uncertainty. She pulled at it. The thin chain snapped with a sharp metallic snap, leaving a red mark on her skin where the metal had bitten in. The locket fell onto the desk with a heavy clink, spinning once before settling into stillness. Elias opened a drawer beneath the desk. His hand emerged holding a snub-nosed revolver. The black steel looked ominous under the spotlight as he placed it on top of the manila folder. Reflections of the room twisted across the barrel. "He's getting out on parole tomorrow, Lena," Elias said, his voice urgent and flat. "Because of you, we have 6 hours to stop him." Lena's eyes moved from the gun to the broken locket. She reached out and touched the cold barrel of the revolver with her index finger. The metal was smooth, colder than she expected, almost welcoming. The red record light reflected in the steel. The rain outside intensified into a roar. Midnight came quickly in the city. The brick building that housed Marcus's attorney's office stood dark and silent on a corner lot. Elias used a crowbar to pry open a side window. The wood splinters, yellow and fresh, scattered like matchsticks. The glass shattered inwardly, falling onto a carpeted floor inside with a tinkling that sounded too loud in the quiet night. Blue moonlight caught on the shards, turning them into diamonds. Lena climbed through the window. Her beige trench coat snagged on a rogue shard of glass. She ripped it free, and the fabric tore with a soft sound, creating a ragged hole near the hem. She dropped into the dark office and pulled out a small pen light from her pocket. The beam swept across the room, illuminating dust motes that floated like ghosts. Rows of law books with their leather spines cracked from age and handling, filing cabinets that stored the bureaucratic architecture of justice. They were looking for documents. Parole location. The place where Marcus was supposed to go after his release. The address that would tell them where to find him, where to intercept him before his freedom became complete. The hallway filled with light. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, bright and searching. A guard in a blue uniform rounded the corner, hand moving toward his holster. The guard was older, maybe 50, with the tired eyes of a man who had seen too many nights, interrupted by the same routine. He shouted the word they had both known was coming. "Freeze!" His shadow loomed on the wall behind him, twisted and enormous, a giant made of darkness. Elias swung the crowbar in a wide arc. The guard blocked with his flashlight, and when metal hit metal, sparks flew, tiny explosions of light in the darkness. Elias followed up with a shoulder charge, driving the guard backward, pinning him against a filing cabinet. Files spilled from the top of the cabinet like snow, documents cascading down around them. People's lives reduced to paper and ink, falling to the floor. Lena moved while the guard and Elias grappled. She grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the desk. The kind of thing lawyers kept to feel important, to have something real in their hands while they dealt in abstractions. As the guard reached for his mace canister, Lena brought the paperweight down in a decisive arc. It connected with his temple, a dull sound that Lena would hear again later in quiet moments. The guard's knees buckled immediately. He slumped to the floor, unconscious, a small trickle of blood running down from his temple and tracing a line toward his ear. Lena stared at her own hands for a moment. But there was no time for shock. They had found what they needed in the filing cabinets, an address for a warehouse in the industrial district, marked for tomorrow morning, marked as Marcus's halfway house. The industrial district at 1 a.m. was a landscape of abandoned things. The warehouse loomed like a sleeping animal, its rusted metal door hanging crooked on its hinges. Elias kicked it open, and it groaned in protest, a metal scream that seemed to echo across the empty lots. The air inside was thick with the smell of gasoline and rotting wood. He held the revolver out with both hands, a tactical stance learned from too many crime documentaries, from too many hours spent studying the mechanics of violence. The red exit sign cast everything in a sickly glow. Puddles on the concrete floor reflected the light back upward, creating a landscape of doubled images, a mirror world where everything existed twice. Lena walked toward a workbench in the center of the floor. On it lay a blue scarf, the exact blue scarf from the photograph, the one that had been around Julian's neck on the night he died. And next to it lay a pile of unpaid bills, envelope after envelope, each one bearing the same name in crisp typeface. Elias Vance. The dates were recent. There was a property tax notice, a hospital bill, a notice from a collection agency. Lena's confusion was hardening into something else, a realization that tasted like copper in her mouth. Elias wasn't looking at the bills. His eyes were fixed on a video camera set up on a tripod, aimed at the door they had just entered. The on light was glowing red. The camera was running. It had been running the entire time. In the lens, reflections twisted like a warning. Lena picked up a photograph from the workbench. It was a still from the night Julian died. Julian on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. But Marcus wasn't holding the knife. Elias was. Elias's face was younger in the image, but his eyes burned with the same intensity, the same rage, frozen forever in that moment of violence. Lena turned the photograph over. On the back, written in handwriting she recognized from love letters found in Marcus's cell, were 2 sentences. "I forgive you, brother, but I can't forget." Elias turned the gun toward Lena. His hand was no longer shaking. He looked at her with a mix of pity and cold necessity. The hammer of the gun cocked with a sound like a tiny guillotine being armed. "I didn't want you to find that," Elias said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "I needed you to kill Marcus for me." The basement stairs descended into darkness. Elias grabbed Lena by the hair and began dragging her toward the wooden trapdoor in the floor. She screamed, her fingers clawing at the floorboards, the rough wood shredding her skin, driving splinters deep beneath her nails. The pain didn't matter. The screaming didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting away. But the darkness from the basement stairs erupted upward. Marcus emerged from the shadows, no longer in his prison jumpsuit, but dressed in a dark hoodie. His face was hard, transformed by an emotion so intense it seemed to reshape his features entirely. He lunged at Elias with the raw power of someone who had spent years in the gym, years perfecting the mechanics of violence in the only place where violence was a language everyone spoke. Elias and Marcus hit the ground together. The impact was enormous, wall-rattling. Elias fired the revolver twice. The muzzle flashes ignited the dark room into a series of snapshots, one frame of Marcus lunging, the next of Elias recoiling, the next of blood. One bullet hit Marcus in the shoulder. The wound opened up, a red flower blooming on his dark hoodie. Marcus didn't stop. He didn't even appear to register the pain. He slammed Elias's head into a concrete pillar. The contact produced a wet thud of bone on stone. Sparks flew as one bullet hit a metal pipe, ricocheting away into the darkness. Marcus wrapped a heavy shipping chain around Elias's throat. It was the kind of chain used for securing cargo, industrial and unforgiving. Elias gasped, his face turning purple as he tried to wedge his hands between the chain and his neck. The veins in Marcus's arms strained against the weight of what he was doing, muscle and sinew working in concert to finish something that had begun 7 years ago. Lena stood over them, holding the revolver she had picked up from the floor. She pointed it at both of them. Her hand was steady now. She looked at them with the eyes of a judge and an executioner, cold and clear. "Let him go, Marcus," she said, her voice hollow and deadly. "I want him to see me do it." Marcus released the chain. He pulled a small, crumpled envelope from his pocket and tossed it at Lena's feet. It was tied with a piece of blue string. Then he pulled a gun from his waistband, the gun Elias had fired, and stepped back. Lena opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were love letters. The handwriting was Julian's, unmistakable in its loops and flourishes, distinctive as a voice. She read the words. "My brother will never understand us, Marcus." The date on the letter was the day before Julian's death. Elias crawled toward the wall, laughing through the blood in his mouth. His laughter was manic, broken, the sound of a man whose internal architecture had collapsed. He looked at Lena with pure spite. "I did it for our family name, Lena," he said, the words coming out wet and bitter. "You were too young to see the filth he was bringing home." Lena looked at Marcus. She saw it then, the thing she should have seen from the beginning. His attraction to her wasn't calculated. He had been looking for Julian in her face, in her mannerisms, in the sound of her breathing on the other side of the glass partition. The grief in Marcus's eyes mirrored her own, and for the first time, Lena understood that they were mourning the same person. They had both loved Julian, both lost him, both been made accomplices to their own destruction. Elias pulled a small remote from his pocket, a detonator. His finger moved toward the button with the inevitability of someone who had already decided where this moment would end. He pressed the button. A series of small explosions rocked the upper floors of the warehouse. The sound was enormous, industrial, the sound of a structure being unmade. Ceiling dust began falling like snow. The basement began to collapse. A burning beam fell between Lena and the exit, cutting off her access to the stairs, trapping her in a maze of falling debris and rising heat. Marcus was pinned under a smaller piece of debris near the door, his leg twisted at an angle that suggested serious injury. Elias stood near the back window, holding a key, his face illuminated by the orange light of the spreading fire. "Come with me, Lena," Elias shouted, reaching out a hand toward her. "We can say Marcus did this. We can be free." Lena turned her back on him. She ran through the flames, jumping over a line of fire to reach Marcus. She grabbed a metal rod from the ground and used it as a lever, straining with every muscle in her body to lift the beam off Marcus's legs. She screamed with effort, and the sound was swallowed by the roar of the fire. Her face was black with soot. Sweat mixed with the ash, creating streaks across her forehead. Elias lunged at her from behind. A shard of glass was in his hand, found in the wreckage and weaponized. He slashed at her back, ripping through the beige trench coat. The blade tore through fabric and skin, and Lena gasped as pain exploded across her shoulders. Blood began soaking into the fabric of the coat, turning the beige dark. Marcus, now free from the debris, grabbed Elias's ankle. He dragged him down into a bloom of smoke and fire as the floor above them finally gave way. Their bodies vanished into the darkness, consumed by the collapsing warehouse. And for a moment, there was silence before the final roar as tons of brick and steel came down. Lena crawled through the smoke. Her hand reached out from a small crawlspace near the foundation, fingers burnt and bloody, leaving red streaks on the concrete as she dragged her body onto the wet grass outside. The sirens of the fire trucks were distant at first, then growing closer, a wail building in the darkness. She lay in the grass for a long time, breathing heavily. When she finally turned to look back at the warehouse, the roof had caved in completely. A single wall remained, and on it, written in large letters that were just barely visible through the smoke and flames, was the name Julian. Written in graffiti done by Marcus years ago, a memorial carved into brick. She clenched the love letters in her left hand. In her right, she held the broken silver locket. She pressed the letters to her chest, over her heart. The rain was starting again, gentle at first, then more insistent. The drops fell on her burnt skin like a kind of benediction, cooling the heat, washing away some of the ash. She stood up, swaying. She walked away from the fire and toward the flashing blue and red lights of the approaching police cars. She didn't look back, though she heard the warehouse collapse behind her, heard the terrible finality of it, heard the sound of history being erased. At the police station, in the early hours of morning, the air was too bright and too cold. Lena sat in a sterile room with fluorescent lights that hummed with a frequency that made thinking difficult. Detective Miller, a man with a tired face and a gray suit, placed a plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside was Elias's charred recording device, melted but mostly intact. The SD card slot looked untouched by the fire. "We found this near the body," the detective said, his voice careful and neutral. Elias Vance had it strapped to his chest. He was recording everything until the end. Lena didn't reach for the bag. She pushed it back across the table. "I already told you what happened," she said. He was obsessed with the case. It consumed him. Detective Miller nodded slowly. He took the bag back. He leaned in and whispered something that only Lena could hear. "Marcus." His prints were on Julian's old locket, the one we found in your hand. He was telling her what they both knew. He was telling her that they had evidence. He was telling her that they could prove Marcus had been there that night, that he had held the locket, that he had touched the dead man one more time before someone called the police. He was telling her that she had a choice about which story to tell. Lena didn't say anything. She signed the statement they prepared for her, the one that described events in a way that protected certain truths while protecting others. When she left the police station, the sun was beginning to rise over the city. She found herself walking toward the river without consciously deciding to go there. The park that ran along the riverbank was foggy in the early morning light, the kind of fog that made the world seem smaller, more intimate, a place where only the present moment existed. The bench that overlooked the river was mossy and damp, and when she reached it, there was a fresh bouquet of lavender sitting on the armrest. The bouquet was bright purple against the gray morning. She picked it up carefully. Lena understood then. Marcus had survived. The beam that had fallen on him, the fire that had consumed the warehouse, the collapse that had seemed so absolute. He had survived it. He had escaped, or someone had helped him escape, or the universe had decided that his story was not finished. She sat on the bench and breathed in the scent of lavender. The smell was almost unbearable, almost too much to hold in her lungs. She thought about Julian. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Elias, consumed by his rage, his obsession, his need to control a story that was never really his to control. She took the photograph of Elias, the one showing him holding the knife, the moment of violence captured forever, and she tore it into small pieces. She tore it carefully at first, and then with increasing force, tearing and tearing until the photograph was 100 small rectangles that no longer resembled anything. She threw them into the river. They floated for a moment, suspended on the current, and then they were gone, disappearing into the moving water. She looked at her reflection in a puddle on the path. She looked like her brother. She looked like herself. She picked up the lavender bouquet and left it on the bench for the world to find. She turned away from the river and began to walk. Her footsteps were firm on the gravel path, rhythmic and steady. The morning was getting brighter. The fog was beginning to lift. And the red record light in her mind, the one that had been running for so long, was finally off.